What's happening, old school scares, and welcome back to the channel, and happy Halloween, right? This is that month. We're going to celebrate a ton of cool stuff around the Halloween season. Every week in October, I'm going to give you a new ranking video of a different Halloween franchise or horror director or some monsters. I'll tell you in just a second what we're going to do and how much fun we'll have with it, but I can't wait to kind of walk through and share this with you. Our first one we're going to do is the Universal Monsters. We're going to rank the top 7 Universal Monsters from best to worst, and we'll go through and kind of tell you why. After that, next week, I have to fly out to Phoenix for work, so I thought it'd be a great idea to actually do the Final Destination movies because something's wrong with me, and why not rank the Final Destination movies before I get in a plane and fly cross country? So our second series is going to be the Final Destination movies. The next series we're going to do is we're going to rank Rob Zombie's movies, so we're going to go through his whole list and hit on all of his movies, including the new Monsters movie. And then the last group we'll have right around Halloween week is we actually rank all the Halloween movies, including Rob Zombie's Halloween movies. So we'll go through and rank all 12 movies, including Halloween Kills, and tell you what we thought from best to worst. So I can't wait to go through and share those with you. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy the rankings as much as I do. You seem to have enjoyed the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street rankings, so I'll throw the links in those videos down here. If you haven't watched them yet, please go through and take a look and see if your opinion is the same as mine. But now I'm going to walk in through the Universal Monster movies for you. If you can see, we've got Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Dracula, a ton of Creature from the Black Lagoon stuff here. I love the Universal Monster movies. They've always been some of my favorite. And when I sat down to try to figure out what movies and monsters we should use and what criteria, it was a little tough. I had to go through and take a look. There's a couple of different lists out there, anywhere from like 36 to 42 movies, but the list that seemed to be the most complete that I found was 41 Universal Monster movies from 1931 to 1956. We started with Dracula in 1931. We ended in 1956 with the final Creature from the Black Lagoon sequel, The Creature Walks Among Us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and hit on the 7 top monsters, or the 7 monsters we had. Now, there were other monsters we could have added in here. Especially as you get into some of the sequels, you have the son of Frankenstein, son of Dracula, daughters of Dracula. You had the Phantom of the Opera, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movies. But I decided to focus what I consider the big 7. And the big 7, when I actually went through and talked about it, was funny. I went and pulled up my Universal Monster shirt afterwards, and it ties right into what we're looking at here, right? So the 7 for me are going to be, and this will be in chronological order, right? So we'll go through the rankings in just a second, but it'll be Dracula, it'll be Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Mummy, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and then finally the Creature from the Black Lagoon. There's a couple of criteria that I'm going to use for me. I'll kind of tell you how I rank the monsters. And here's the thing I'll tell you at the beginning. I don't think there's a bad monster in the Universal Monster catalog. I just think that there are some that are more iconic than others. So that's kind of how I ranked it, right? How good were the movies? How scary were they? How iconic was that monster and that image? When you think about it today, does it still hold up? Are there any good scares in the movie? And what's the creature or monster's motivation that kind of, made that monster or creature iconic? So when I kind of go through those criteria, I'll walk through the list and kind of give you, again, my list from 7 to 1. And we're going to start right away with my lowest creature on the list, which is going to be the Mummy. Now, for the Mummy franchise, we actually had 6 movies. We had 4 different actors play the Mummy over 23 years. We had legends like Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. take on that title role. And I believe the first movie really does deliver a really solid origin story. I think it's really well done when you get into the Emotep character. When you start to get into like the Karras character and it kind of morphed as it went along, I think the Mummy lost some of its effectiveness. The character is iconic. When you see that, that mummy visage, it is a little bit scary, but the biggest problem for me with the Mummy always has been, as an undead character, he's not charismatic like Dracula. He's not hulking like Frankenstein. I just find that overall the Mummy's never been particularly scary. He's really thin and frail. There is kind of that cool hypnotism piece when he kind of, reforms, and there's some of that that's kind of cool. But again, holistically, overall, I think the Mummy is just the least frightening out of the movie monsters, and I think there's not as many scares in that series as you get into some of the other monster movies when we go through the Universal catalog. So that's why I have the Mummy last. Again, still a great monster, still a great character, really well portrayed in the first movie, and I think out of all of them, the first movie is excellent, so go check that one out. You have diminishing returns as you go through the series. Our next monster on the list is going to be the Invisible Man. This one was tough because I really like the Invisible Man. I really think the first Invisible Man, just like we talked about with the Mummy, is really effective. It's really good. It's really scary. We would get 6 movies in this franchise from 1933 to 1951. I think about the first movie. You had James Whale, who would direct the first Invisible Man, who also did Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. Great director, one of the best horror directors of all time, in my personal opinion. You had John Fulton's effects, right? You had Claude Rains' portrayal as the Invisible Man, and he really portrayed the first Invisible Man character as unsympathetic, right? I think this is probably the first true visage of evil, I think, in the franchise, where somebody's gone mad, and there's not a lot of redeeming qualities. There really isn't any redeeming qualities in the Invisible Man. Like, he's using power, or wants to seize power to kind of take over the world, or become, all controlling of everything. And I really like that, because there isn't a redeeming quality in the Invisible Man, especially in the first movie. As the movies went along, and you'd have like the Invisible Woman, the Invisible Agent, the movies really did morph and become comedy, horror comedy, thrillers. The Invisible Man is probably, out of all the franchises, the franchise that couldn't figure out what they wanted the monster to be. And that's why I think, again, it's probably a little bit lost. It's also tough to have a really great character design when your character's invisible. Now, that being said, the original Invisible Man with the smoking jacket and the bandages is actually really good and freaky. And the effects done by John Fulton's team back in that time were amazing. The sitting down in the chair, the smoking, the ability when he looks in the mirror and you have the reflection kind of playing back. Again, we forget this movie was done in the early 1930s. Phenomenal. Incredibly well done. I love where we go with that character. The problem is, again, once you get beyond the first movie, it's tough to make a scary monster. That dissolve when the Invisible Man dies in the first movie and he goes to the skull, then back to his human visage, is really good and really effective. And I'm a pretty big fan of the end of the first Invisible Man. I think that does a great job, and that's what, for me, elevates it to number 6 ahead of The Mummy. Realistically, The Bride only is a star in one movie with some smaller roles in the other movies. Again, directed by James Whale, came out in 1935. You have the main character, and I don't want to mispronounce her name, so I'm going to try to hopefully say it right. Alessa Lanchester was amazing. She played Mary Shelley, plus she played the Bride. The Bride is such a great character. Iconic look with the tall conical hair, with the lightning white strikes through it, the pale visage. A beautiful woman as well, so actually a beautiful monster, which was great, which really did lead her to being kind of that first lady of horror, and still iconic today. When you think about the Treehouse of Horror from The Simpsons, where you'd have Marge dressed up as the Bride. When you get into any sitcom and they're doing those monster movies, you'd always have some version of the Bride of Frankenstein. So still an iconic titular monster is the fact that she's just not a major player outside of this movie. But I think her movie is the best sequel out of all of the sequels from any of the Universal monster movies. I also think it's probably one of the top 2 or 3 best Universal monster movies, period. And it's really thanks to the direction and the incredible acting in this movie that really do make her a sympathetic character, which we don't get a lot in these movies, right? There are a couple times when you have really sympathetic characters, but the Bride truly is a sympathetic character that comes across very clearly on the big screen. And again, you think about just visually what this movie looked like. It was stunning. Great acting. Again, was interesting. Right now we go from Karloff to Lugosi playing the monster, opposite of our main character in this movie. And again, it plays incredibly well, and I think it's very well done. So number 5, if she had more appearances or more movies, I think she would 100% move up the list. But what a great, iconic movie monster. Number 4, time to piss a bunch of people off on this ranking. Number 4 for me is Dracula. And hear me out in this movie. Again, with Dracula, we had a ton of movies. We had 7 movies, if you include the Spanish version that was shot at the same time as the original, which, by the way, is said to be by everybody a better movie. You have the amazing performance by Bela Lugosi, just absolutely incredible. And again, the problem with this monster for me, and the reason I have him ranked at 4 and I have the other 3 movies ranked above him, is you had a ton of different characters, including Lon Chaney Jr. and John Carradine, play versions of Dracula in the next 6 movies in the sequels in here. None of them could hold a candle to what Lugosi had done, but the other problem is, where do you go with this character, right? This character is really locked into that performance, and there was nothing else you could add new to it. Once you get beyond the initial performance, the initial, time seeing Dracula and understanding, the vampire and the undead piece, the movie does become somewhat one note, and again, I think the character itself is less scary. It's also not an incredibly scary or original monster design, right? Every single kid with their first monster was, a vampire, because you could get some white powder makeup, some fangs, and a cape, and now you're Dracula. So again, a really easy monster to kind of make up, but in that situation, I think it actually takes away a little bit from the monster itself, and that's why I have to rank him so low. Not that Lugosi doesn't do a good job, or even the other characters as they go along. I think Dracula is a very very fleshed out monster and character. I just think it gets a little lost after, that first iteration, and I don't know if you can add a lot to the other movies that make him incredibly scary. The one thing that is scary is he's charming, and I always thought a good charming monster was scary, and I think Dracula does have that, where he has, especially those 1930 terms, that sex appeal that made him very different than the other monsters you had out there. So that's kind of a cool part of that character. But for me, it's very tough to rank him above the other three monsters we're going to talk about, just because I think the design really is it's somewhat one note, and it doesn't get beyond that first initial appearance that you had by Lugosi in 31 and elevate beyond to anything else. To be incredibly clear, the top three for me was super challenging because I love all of these monsters, and I'm going to slow down for a second. And if you actually take a look at my monster collection, the Frankenstein collectible, the Frankenstein pop, the Wolfman collectible, tons of Creature from the Black Lagoon stuff. These are my favorite monsters on here, there is no question. But I go for third is going to be the Wolfman. And you can see I have the Wolfman mask above me. I love this movie. Well, I love this character for a couple reasons. One is we had like 5 movies in the franchise. They all came out in the 40s. But what was awesome about this is they were all portrayed by Lon Chaney Jr. He does an amazing job. This is an iconic look. And I think the cool thing about this, as I was kind of going through and thinking about the list, as we've had werewolf movies and Wolfman movies, like Wolfman in particular never changes. This look became iconic, and this is what every other Wolfman you've ever seen look like. But I even thought about the werewolf movies and how they still kind of took some version of what we had from this original version of the Wolfman and try to figure how we morphed the human and wolf element. Now, when you get to some of the movies that weren't really werewolf movies, I mean, they were werewolf movies, but it wasn't, it was more just a wolf. When you think about like, an American Werewolf in London, when it went just really to more of a wolf character, yeah, that doesn't tie in, but any wolf character that was bipedal always really took kind of that inspiration from the Wolfman, and I think it's a credit to Lon Chaney, and it's a credit to what the character was created in 1941 that it's still so relevant today. And I think about the scare factor and the wow factor back then, and that's the top 3 monsters for me have that factor above the other 4. That movie, you think about, I know it was dissolves, and that's how they changed that werewolf transformation, but back in the 40s, that was terrifying. There was nothing that had been seen like that before, and it was so well done. And then when you actually got into the iconic character, he was probably the scariest out of the Universal monster movies until our number 2 monster came along, in my opinion, because it was really a genuinely scary character. And again, it wasn't, some of the humanity was lost, but again, it was sympathetic, right? Larry Talbot was a sympathetic character. So I think even as his human form was a sympathetic character, as bad as the monster form was. And the monster form really wasn't trying to be evil, it was just kind of cursed. One of the best, most iconic looks, one of the scariest of the movies. I think just overall incredibly well made. Again, same thing, you'd have diminishing returns as you go along, although I will tell you that, The Wolfman Meets Frankenstein is an amazing sequel, one of my favorites. And I actually think The Wolfman, when he meets Abbott and Costello, is actually one of the better horror comedies in the Universal Classic Monster series. All right, guys, I try to be fair if nothing else, and for me, I think you can clearly see that I like the Creature from the Black Lagoon by far the most. I have him ranked number 2, and there's a really simple reason why. While I think it's an iconic design, the Gillman's an incredible makeup setup. I love everything about the first movie, the setting, the pacing, the monster itself, the respect that they had for the character by, using a professional swimmer who could stay underwater for multiple minutes at a time without an air tank, so you didn't have the air bubbles coming out. I mean, everything about this movie is just right, and the character's so amazing. The Gillman, to me, is my favorite out of all the monsters, just from a style standpoint, because I think it looks somewhat realistic, which is great. I think the character, is something that, could happen in nature, but it's scary enough without being overdone. You look at the monster itself, there's no giant fangs. While he has claws, again, it's not like goofy over the top. It's not Freddy Krueger glove claws. I mean, it's looks like something that potentially could have happened in nature. And at that time in the 50s, again, to go into the Amazon and show something new and unique and exciting is awesome. And I think that the monster shines for that. The reason he's not number 1 for me is actually really simple. He has 2 sequels. The second one is okay. The third one is not good at all. The Creature Walks Among Us is actually a bad movie. It's been lampooned a million times, and rightfully so, because it's just not great. So for me, I think what hurts him the most and keeps him from being number 1 for me is his legacy. But I think if we were just going by creature design, by scare factor, all of that stuff, I think he's my favorite monster. But he loses out a little bit to our number one monster, just based on his legacy and the fact that he only had 3 movies in this timeline. And the second and third ones were okay and not very good. No shock here. Our number one monster is the monster himself, Frankenstein. What can you say about the Frankenstein, series? I think, when I look at the series, overall, it's the best series out of the Universal Monster movies. The iconic first movie, Bride, which is by far, I think, the best sequel in the franchise. But Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman is also a great sequel in the series. So while you had a bunch of movies, I think you actually had in the Frankenstein series, you had 5 movies. I'm sorry, we got 8 Frankenstein movies. Out of 8 of them, I actually think 3 are excellent. Like, I'd rate them 8 or higher, right? I think, again, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Bride, and the original movie are amazing. So when you think about this character, right, and again, this character originally brought to life by Boris Karloff, played by many different actors as you went along, but the character makeup didn't change. The look of the character, a little bit of what the character would do would change, right? His ability to speak or his ability to be a little bit more expressive over time, but the character itself was still that same iconic character, right? Flat forehead, green paint, lightning bolts in the neck, giant boots, big honking, I guess we can say honking, but big hulking monster. This character just shines. And this character today, again, I think out of all the Universal Monster movies, if you went up to 100 people on the street today and you actually, showed them all the masks I have up here and said, hey, who is that person? I think 95% of the public still today would get Frankenstein, where they might struggle with some of the other monsters up there. And to me, that makes him the most iconic. I also tell you that this was nightmare fuel back then, right? Bringing an evil monster back to life using a criminal's brain, and then, making him a mate, and then having him fight other monsters. Like, again, when you think about what this movie was, it truly was one of the more terrifying movies back then, and so well made, specifically the first movie, where you have, the monster throwing Maria into the water, and then they cut away, and it makes the movie seem even more, deranged or evil or scary than it actually was. And that was a great decision that was made because they were trying to censor some of the stuff that was going on. So when you think about Frankenstein, just an iconic monster. And again, to me, out of all the monsters you have in the Universal universe, he is the most iconic, the best combination of scares, acting, thrills, all that stuff you want to put into it falls onto Frankenstein's monster. So that's my list, guys. That's going to be my top, my top 7. You might have a little bit different. If you do, please share with me in the comments down below. We'd love to kind of have that conversation with you. And I love sharing these classic monster movies. This is what Old School Scares was designed for, to go back to those throwback to the old movies and help you think about them a little bit differently. And if you haven't watched those movies, there's an amazing Blu-ray collection that came out a few years ago. Go back and watch them. They look incredible. Frankenstein has a great transfer. The Creature of Black Lagoon transfer in 3D looks amazing if you still have a 3D TV, and I know that technology's kind of come and gone, but it looks so good on the 3D technology. So go back and check it out. It's just an amazing series, and I'm so happy to share it with you. Like I said, we're going to head into a couple more series the next few weeks. Next week will be Final Destination, then we'll get into Rob Zombie's horror movies, and then finally we'll finish with that Halloween franchise right around Halloween week. So we appreciate all of you checking out the channel. Also keep an eye out. There will be a couple other movie reviews coming along to some of the new movies. I do plan on going, I will review Smile, which may have already come out before I do this. And I will be going to see Halloween Kills in the theater, so I will do those reviews for you as well. And who knows, hopefully my local movie house gets some of the classic monster movies that I haven't done the last couple of years that I can go in and see again, like I did last year with Scream and Evil Dead, and share some of those reviews with you, as well as seeing some of those on the big screen again. If you haven't done it so far, hit like and subscribe. And as always, stay scary. Thank you so much.